Getting back to the 58 Bassman, I have made slow but excellent progress. Frustratingly, I still have to wait for some parts to arrive, but let me show you where we're at now. This amp had all the original tube sockets changed out quite some time ago for these ceramics. And these ceramics are very high quality, very nice, but not even close to being period correct. So I've put in some more period correct phenolics here and some Belton sockets for the preamp tubes, which have tube shields. These others did not. Tube shields can help with RF and cell phone interference and Wi-Fi interference and stuff. If you don't want to use them, take them off, but they can actually be very helpful. You can see that the chassis has been dramatically cleaned inside and out, and the switches have been removed, and the standby switch used to be the power switch. The old standby switch was a replacement and was not in great condition. So the old power switch has been moved to the standby switch, and a new carling switch has been put in here for power. And here I've got the one of the primaries connected to it. The other side is disconnected. And here on the standby switch, which is wired, the first pin on the left goes to pin 8 of the rectifier. This other side goes to the board, and it will once I run that wire. And this cap goes to chassis ground. It's a 47 nanofarad, 630 volt, which is there so that there is some capacitance on the output of the rectifier tube, even if the amp is in standby. Keeps it from having massive pops. Due to the way freshly rectified DC behaves, it really wants to have some kind of load, and that cap serves that purpose. The old Astron is gone, and there's a Vichy there. It had a very non-original fuse holder that was not appropriate, so I put in this old Bakelite one, which is much more appropriate. It's not an old one, but it's Bakelite. You know, it's styled like the original. It's not been wired up yet. And the polarity switch, the ground switch, I removed the cap which was going to the transformer mounting hardware, and these two are disconnected. I have the other primary going here, and that's where the neutral will go once I install a new power cable. Here you can see a new chassis ground point with the solder prepared for the ground of the power cable, which will be coming. And here is the old connection for the HT center tap, and it used to have the filament center tap as well. And those were just bird-nested strands of wire kind of tack soldered to the old solder. Someone had been in there and had done them wrong. So I removed all the old solder and made sure that there was some scoring to the chassis, and I retinned it, and I reconnected the HT center tap, but I have removed the filament center tap, which I will tape off on itself, as you've seen in other amps, and this amp will be getting some heater balance resistors, some 100 ohms. So that's that. So we have the two primaries. We've got the HT center tap. We've got the heater wires going to the lamp, and this red and blue striped for the bias will be going to a new bias diode standoff location. The red HT wires are going here to pins 3 and 5 of the new octal socket for the rectifier, with 1 in 4007s going from pin 3 to pin 4 and from pin 5 to pin 7, so that there's additional rectification help. In a healthy tube, they won't be doing much. If a tube has a problem, if there's a surge or anything, it can really help. It's an inexpensive bit of insurance, especially with modern production rectifier tubes. The tube that came with this amp is an old one, and it's got a little bit of an acoustic rattle. And I don't know if that's a sign that it's failing, or it may go another 10 years, may go another 10 minutes. I don't know. This will help, particularly if we have to replace it. And then the yellow heater wires are going here to pins 2 and 8, and 8 is also where the wire going off to the standby switch is there. And all the octal sockets are held in place with these nylock nuts. And you get a pretty good sense for how much cleaner the chassis is. You could, if you wanted to, eat lunch off it now. I don't recommend it for the amp's sake, but so much better than it was with all that furry yuck, dead bug fest. Speaking of yuck, the area where the speaker jacks are is now almost unrecognizable. So I removed all those jacks, and I cleaned all the metal surfaces in the chassis on both sides, and I cleaned the heck out of the jacks, and I got layers and layers and layers of decades of grease and grime off them, and I tested them. They were all fine. They've not been wired together yet, as you can see, but I've tested them so that when they are wired together, they should work just fine. Thank you very much. With clean contacts, probably for the first time since the Carter administration. And the 3 preamp sockets are in place, Beltons, and with the Belton tube shield, so there's no tube in there right now. And as you can see on V1 and V3, I have pins 8 and 3 already pressed down, so they'll have those shared cathodes. Very nice. You can see these 2 holes in the chassis. There's a third up here you can't see right now. Those used to have rubber grommets, and in very, very old amps like this, that rubber can become just kind of petrified. It was really hard, and in fact, it was crumbling. So those are gone, and some new 3/8" neoprene grommets will be installed, and I'll run the transformer wires back through them. The knobs and the jacks and all the pot hardware and the switches were taken off, and this panel was cleaned as thoroughly as possible while doing no damage to the white silk screen. So it is all dedusted. It is all defunct. There are a little bit of bits of rust, which I can't do anything about now, lacking a TARDIS. Then everything was put back. All the hardware was cleaned thoroughly. Combination of soaking in WD-40 to get rusty stuff dealt with, and then ultrasonic cleaner to get all the minute little particles and all the crevices and cracks out. And now it's all been put back together. It's much happier. The chassis is clean. The transformers have been wiped, but not thoroughly cleaned. There's no need, but they're not covered in tons of dust and yuck now. That cleaning is especially crucial here at these 4 screw points. This was all dirty because that's where the mating surfaces of the doghouse cover will go, and that's where crucial grounds are made, though I may change that in when I repopulate this. Now you see all this dark stuff here? This was sandy brown in the last video. One of the old electrolytics had exploded its guts all in here, so this was all old yucky tannish, beigeish, vomitish electrolytic that was spilled in there. I've got that all cleaned up. You can see it is a caustic substance, and it did discolor this metal. Big time fun. Anyway, this has all been cleaned with isopropyl and WD-40, and now cleaned off. I'll probably give it one more cleaning with some naphtha. I don't need to go crazy and buff it or anything. It's all right if this thing's got some vintage appeal to it, but I will be repopulating this very differently going forward. We'll do that in the video when those parts arrive. So right now, this is literally an empty shell. And here are the parts which are not making the cut. The old wire, because even if I were to clean it, get it from that yucky brownish green back to closer to yellow, that cloth has seen things, man. It is semi-rotten cotton and some out of spec 1 watts and the 56K that's not going to be used in the bias because the bias is going to get a trim pot. The Astrons leak, they're garbage, and some 68K resistors in the input, which were quite noisy. When I had everything taken apart, I took this brass panel out and I removed the old solder and the old solder ground wires, and I used some Brasso to get this really nice and clean. I didn't try to make it factory. I could have scrubbed it even more, some very, very fine grained sandpaper, maybe 1200 grit with some Brasso. This thing would have looked factory. I decided to leave a little bit of the character, like the little mark from that old wire there, just where it's a little bit cleaner in that spot. But this is so much better. It's actually reflective again, and it's not covered in a layer of grease and film and absolute yuck and horror as far as good grounds go. Every pot was individually cleaned inside and out and lubricated on the inside, not the outside, and tested. Of the pots in the amp, only the base pot is non-original, but it does seem to be a fairly old pot. I've not looked for a date code, but it's not current production CTS or Burns. It's nice quality and seems to function just fine. All the others, I believe, are original to the amp, or if they are replacements from a similar period of Fender. but they're all in good shape. They all measure fine, and they will all be much happier now that they are not filled inside and out with dirt. The presence pot posed a minor mystery when it came in. The amp came in, and the cap on the left, which is an old Astron, was wired just like this, with lugs 1 and 2 joined together, and the cap going to the body. And it's a 25K pot, so I would expect a 4.7K resistor from lug 3 to ground, as you find in later Marshalls and you find in most actual Bassman. The earlier wiring would have been a 5K linear pot without this resistor, and lug 1 would be at ground, lug 2 would have a cap going to ground, and lug 3 is where the input wire would come. And that's what you see on the Bassman schematic, but they didn't do that very long. They actually went to this 25K setup with the 4.7K across it, and it gives a slightly different taper to the present circuit, and it also takes the DC off the present circuit, so you don't get that as you turn it. Marshall copied the Bassman schematic, and the schematic had the 5K without this resistor in parallel across it. So that's why 60s Marshalls, the present circuit goes, and then the 70s, they changed it to this. I'm not sure of the actual year. And some people prefer the sound and the taper of the 5K with the single cap as opposed to the 25K with the cap and the resistor. And that's fine. But if you have a Marshall or a Fender clone where the presence goes, that can be normal. Don't worry about it. But since it did not have this resistor as it came in, I did some archaeology and I found a slight discoloration on the pot where I think solder used to be. So someone had removed it. So this amp would not have had much negative feedback at all due to the way the negative feedback circuit works in this amp. I don't want to go into too great a detail, but there is a large difference between a 25K pot and essentially a 4K pot, which that resistor makes. You can see I did install new bus wire with new solder points to the brass control strip, and those wires are going pretty much exactly where they need to go for the eyelets that they're going to connect to. I'll measure how far this way before they bend. I'll bend them all up and the new board will slide down onto those ground points, but everything should be just hunky-dory. And I've got the cleaned backing board in place until that time comes. So life for this amp is slowly approaching good again. Here's the underside of the cleaned and partially repopulated board. You can see I have recreated all the wires beneath. Now, they seem to have used yellow for all these. I did use red here and here, so that from the outside you can tell which of these grid connections goes to which tube. The convention in the later AB763 is that red is right. That sounds political. The red is the tube on the right when that situation comes up. And I chose to use red here for the connection to the standby switch, and I chose to use blue for the connection going to the presence pot due to personal preference of how things should be. Most of the other things I will go ahead and use just the yellow because that's what was in here, even though it's not as good as the later color codes implemented. So I've rebuilt the bias supply here, so 15K, and I've got a 27K in there now, but this is an new old stock resistor, which had some very nice thick leads here. And I've got a 25K or 22K trim pot coming, which I can solder directly to this wire and then cut the wire where necessary. So that'll give us a very well secured trim pot in series with 27K. So original is 56K. We'll be able to get to the 56K value and lower very easily to adjust the bias properly. And then the 10 microfarad 100 volt Vichy caps there. Here, it's got a modern 2-watt metal film versus the old 1-watt carbon comp for that 4.7K, because those things drift and absorb moisture. Same thing for the 10K here. The 27K negative feedback resistor, the 100K plate resistor, the 82K plate resistor, the two 1 meg grid leaks, the 470 ohm cathode resistor, the 6.8K 1-watt tail resistor. Those are all original to the amp. They were all removed. They were cleaned very thoroughly, both the bodies and the leads. And they have been put back correctly, just like they were in 1958. So as much as possible, still has the original resistors. It has some new 220K grid leaks here, bias leaks, some new Vishay 100 nanofarad 630 volt caps, which span the entire distance. If you saw the previous video, you saw how someone had undone all this to really undone a lot of stuff just to add some grid stoppers in the wrong way, in my opinion. Anyway, I'm waiting for the 400 volt 100 nanofarad cap to go here, and the 400 volt 22 nanofarad cap to go here. I've got this Vishay 450 volt 10 microfarad here. The schematic calls for 8 microfarad. No one in the world can hear the difference between a 10 microfarad and an 8 microfarad, and this Vishay is a particularly high quality capacitor. Here we have a new 100K slope resistor, a stock original 100K cathode resistor. What seems to be the stock domino treble cap, when I measured it, is still measuring 250 picofarad. The 47 picofarad that's supposed to go here and the 100 picofarad that's on the volume pot, those caps measure open. They are dead. They're getting replaced. This is a 400 volt 100 nanofarad cap here, and this is a 400 volt 22 nanofarad cap here, because if I'd used the 630 volt versions, they would not fit next to that domino, and I had them, and there's only going to be about 180, 200 volts present on them, so 400 volts is more than twice what is necessary here. A note on this, if you look at the schematic, again, it's going to tell you 22, 22, and that's what you dutifully find in Marshalls, starting with the JTM45, 22 and 22. But the ones that Fender actually put in production were 22 and 100, so that's what's in here. The two 820 ohm resistors for the two cathodes are long gone, and I'm ordering some new ones because I don't have any 820 that are long enough to make this span. I'm getting two new old stock 820 ohm cathode resistors with long leads to make this span. This one will get a Vishay bypass cap across it. This one will not, though that is a popular mod. We are going to start with stock. Similarly, I'm out of 270K resistors. That's not a value I use very often. I did put in new 68Ks here for the input grid stoppers, and new 100K plate resistors, and we'll have some 22 nanofarads here, and life will be good. You can see here I've got the red for the grid going to the right, the yellow for the grid going to the left. Just makes it easy to know which one goes where. And all these other wires will be yellow, just like these here. Though I ran out, I've got more on order. Here's a little brown one I left out for this purpose. Yeah, this is new. This is original. It's not just a matter of this being kind of ugly. This cloth has actually degraded over the decades. It's had so much moisture and so much yuck in it. I don't trust it to actually insulate anymore. It's really time to retire this cloth-covered wire and give it the fresh. I love repopulating old boards like this. I love building, starting from fresh and just getting it right. It really is pretty. It's jewel-like when you do it right. I've noticed that when you take your time to do very, very good work, the end result is beautiful, even if your primary goal is not visual beauty. But it's nice when we end up there just because of the way everything else works, scientifically, electronically. Anyway, I hope that you agree and that such things make you happy to see. And come back next time and see some more of this. Thanks for watching.